Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Shout out to the Michigan musicians Samantha Cooper and Charlie Millard for their song We Don't Want These Data Centers, which just welcomed us in. Next slide, please. Before we get started with our content today, here's just a few logistic notes. If you don't see the slides, you can click on the tab at the top of your screen that says Text Screen. Also today in this webinar, you have access to the chat feature and Q&A. For the chat, please make sure that you are messaging everyone, not just hosts and panelists. You can change this in the To field. And you should see the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please, as much as possible, add your questions here, not in the chat. It's much easier for us to answer them there. We invite everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, location, group or community organization, if any, and what your data center fight looks like. And we ask that there's no AI note takers, please, for today's session. You should also see a quick poll. Please do fill that out so we know a little bit more about who is in the room today. Next slide. So welcome to the intersections of big tech's nuclear buildout and data center expansion. My name is Ali, and I'm the Director of Community Partnerships at AI Now and co-coordinator of the Data Center Working Group. This is the 7th and final session of our Data Center Policy and Practice training series based on our North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit. Next slide. Very briefly, the AI Now Institute is a policy research organization that pushes back against the trajectory of the AI industry away from commercial surveillance, concentration of power, and lack of public accountability. And we are a member of the Data Center Working Group, which is co-hosting this series and is a multi-state cross-issue network fighting to stop the data center build-out. Next slide. Each session of our training series dives deep into a specific policy area to help us identify the strongest possible policy recommendations to stop data centers, as well as scaffolded steps to get there for our political environments where that isn't possible. And we also feature real-life strategies from a panel of organizers on the ground. If you missed our last session, which was a special 90-minute workshop mapping the data center industry, you can watch the recording at the link in the chat. And next week, we will be sending out a recap of all of the sessions with recordings, slides, and resources to everyone who registered. You can also access those materials at the link in the chat that Sophie is dropping in. Next slide. So today's session demystifies, can we go one back? Thank you. Today's session demystifies how big tech is driving the current nuclear energy build-out to power AI in lockstep with the government's undermining of nuclear regulation. We will also explore the strongest possible federal policy interventions and local and state organizing strategies to counter this agenda. So to kick us off, Dr. Heidi Kleff at the AI Now Institute will break down why the tech industry is so interested in nuclear energy. I will then review these specific policy interventions, and we'll spend the second half of the session in a panel discussion featuring Shai Morgan and Hilary Flint. Next slide, please. I'm going to bring up Heidi to get us started. Dr. Heidi Kleff, Chief AI Scientist at AI Now, specializes in safety and security evaluations of safety critical systems, including implementation of software and AI within nuclear plants, such as the Hinkley Point C, aviation, and autonomous vehicles. She previously led the safety assessment of codecs at OpenAI and evaluations of AI cyber capabilities for the UK's AI Security Institute, and we're dropping her full bio in the chat. Heidi's going to give us a presentation to help us understand this moment. Why are we seeing this coordinated push to expand nuclear for the benefit of AI? And for folks who have questions, again, please use the Q&A feature. Heidi, I'm going to turn it over to you. Sophie, you can stop screen sharing.
Hi, everyone. Can you all see my slides okay? I'll take that as a yes. So it's great to be here. And as Ali mentioned, I'm here to talk about the undermining of nuclear regulation that's currently happening in service of AI. The US data center power demand is forecast to double to 66 gigawatt in 2027 from the 31 gigawatts in 2025 that it's currently using. And to give you some perspective, 60 gigawatts is about the peak demand of the UK, which is where I currently live, when we also have average demands of 30 gigawatts. So this is quite a significant amount of power to power just the US data centers alone. And a lot of this, as many of you know here, comes from the AI's energy demands. You have ChatGPT, which, consumes between 10 to 90 times more energy per query than a conventional Google search. And that's not to mention the training and the inference of these new models that are incredibly, more that have been scaled up much more significantly than what we've seen before. We have tech data centers that are pressuring local power grids with their energy needs. And we have electricity consumption of AI that is expanding fossil fuel use and delaying the retirement of coal-fired plants. I think these are all things that many of you here know about. But what they're, in sort of their search for the energy, leading tech companies are also looking to nuclear to satisfy their energy needs, not just because they need it, but also because nuclear is often seen as a more like cleaner energy than fossil fuels, which I think they feel like they can leverage for their own reputations. So big tech has been, in the last couple of years, investing in a lot. They've been investing in SMRs, which stand for small modular reactor, nuclear fusion, restarting of 3 Mile Island, and also, traditional nuclear power plants a lot. And we also have things like Sam Altman investing in those very startups. So we're not just getting these energy agreements, we're getting, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, all investing in these companies directly as well. And this is actually putting a lot of pressure on the nuclear industry. So with the new energy demands across all other sectors, it's also increasing. It's not just data centers that need powers, but if we look at data centers alone, they'll be using around 12% of US power by 2030, compared with 3% in 2022. So this urgency for immediate energy needed to power AI puts an unprecedented pressure on nuclear regulators to bypass a lot of traditional nuclear safety mechanisms to meet demands and build nuclear faster. Well, is that even feasible? Can you build nuclear faster so you can sort of satisfy the needs of AI demands? Well, not really. And that's because nuclear development timelines often take 10 to 20 years. And that's completely out of step with the pace of AI deployment. As we've sort of seen, these demands are needed immediately. They're being asked for by 2028, even 2030. And the thing is that the current technology of nuclear reactors, which they're called large conventional nuclear reactors, are only capable of producing up to 1 gigawatt of power per unit. And the AI companies are demanding 5 to 50 gigawatts of additional power by 2028. So how is that even possible? And to sort of give you an example of one of the power plants that I've worked on is Hinkley Point C, because it's one of the new traditional nuclear power plants that are being built from scratch. That announcement was made in 2010. It took about 2 to 6 years to get the final approval from EDF, who was building this nuclear plant, and the UK government, right? And then the expected completion date of it is actually in 2027, and that's already been delayed to 2030. So again, we're looking at 20 years. So what's the solution for this? Well, the industry think that they can essentially fast track all of nuclear processes to try to make this happen. And they're doing this across 3 separate fast-tracking initiatives, which is what I'll be discussing for the rest of the talk today. There's US federal policy initiatives, which are essentially using the AI arms race to sort of, weaponize that and discard risk and safety thresholds that have been set for nuclear really since the era of Cold War. We have AI companies pushing for generative AI to essentially fast-track nuclear regulatory documents. And then finally, we have advanced nuclear reactors, where we're seeing a lot of investment from both governments and, as I mentioned before, tech companies into new technologies like SMRs, advanced modular reactors, or fusion. And they see that as kind of like a quick solution, except those designs are unproven and you can't really deploy them by 2028. So what is the feasibility of these initiatives and their impact on nuclear safety, security, and even nuclear safeguarding? And do they increase the public's potential exposure to radiation levels? So starting off with, federal policy initiatives, these slides will be a bit text heavy because there's a lot of essentially like executive orders that were launched in May 2025 to roll back a bunch of nuclear regulation. So bear with me, but I'll try to give a summary of like what this means overall. So the first one I think is called the Ordering the Reform of Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it demands that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the US's nuclear regulator, the NRC, commit to sort of arbitrary timelines and deadlines for approving nuclear licensing and construction permits. If you remember when I talked about Hinkley Point C, that process took about, 3 to 6 years, and here they're demanding 18 months. The executive order also pushes for the dismantling of one of the very key safety pillars of nuclear safety called the linear no threshold model, or LNT, and ALARA. And in a bit, I'll get into more about that. But for now, I want to talk about the other executive orders. You have the NRC as well, which is now being required to consult with the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy about the determination of radiation exposure limits, since now they're no longer going to follow LNT and ALARA. And essentially what all of this means is that the independence of the NRC is strict, and safety and licensing is now being deferred to political actors such as the DOE and the DOD. And these are two people who work with regulators. These are not impartial actors. They have their own, goals. They're not really there to look out for the public safety like a nuclear regulator would, like the NRC. This also puts pressure on regulators to deviate from safety processes to meet these sort of contrived time boxing and these infeasible timescales that are being proposed. So another executive order is the reinvigorating the nuclear industrial base. And again, it uses the AI arms race to promote the construction of 10 new large reactors. And these are not SMR, these are traditional reactors by 2030. So again, this accelerated timeline to have them in construction very soon, kind of expediting this regulation process. And then you have the deploying advanced nuclear reactor technologies for national security, which uses national security imperatives, surprise, to exclude the construction of nuclear reactors on federal sites from NEPA and sort of bars any review by the NRC. And this executive order is super interesting because I think this is exactly where we're seeing the marriage between the data center buildout and the nuclear buildout, which is AI data centers operating on DOE facilities are now being designated as defense facilities, while also allocating any nuclear reactors on DOE facilities to power AI infrastructure. So here's where we're seeing the exact connection of nuclear reactors essentially being in service of AI infrastructure, all under sort of the guise of national security imperatives, which are essentially being used to bypass existing regulatory oversight for both data centers and nuclear plants that would power them. And I think it also takes the hand out of a lot of, local and sort of state level lawmaking, because this is all for, on federal land. Finally, I want to mention this reactor pilot program that came out of a lot of these executive orders, and essentially paves a new way for reactors to be licensed and authorized under DOE jurisdiction without needing any NRC reviews. So I think overall, we're seeing the independence, again, of the NRC stripped and the safety and licensing of new reactors being deferred to these political actors. So let's go back to LNT and ALARA and why you should care about it. I'll try to talk, this is quite a technical concept in nuclear safety, but I'll try to talk about it in a high level so you understand the impacts it has on sort of the public. So essentially, the idea of the linear no threshold model basically says that there's a linear relationship between radiation dose and the health effects it has on humans, specifically cancer. And it implies that the exposure to ionizing radiation, which would be sort of the dangerous byproduct of a nuclear plant, as harmful. And, no matter how low the dose is. And it's also seen that the effect is cumulative. So a principle that kind of came out of LNT, and this is kind of the standard that set, this kind of like the safety threshold for all nuclear plants, is called ALARA, which is this idea that residual risk to radiation must be reduced as far as reasonably achievable. So whatever you can do, you should do it. And this is not just like a random concept that the US came up with and then removed. This is actually a long proven scientific concept that has international scientific consensus, has been built over many decades by a huge amount of international scientists and organizations, including the IAEA. And also, there's no proven scientific alternative to it. People have tried other models, and essentially they're non-conclusive, and there's no better way than to essentially go on with LNT and LRO, which, by the way, these organizations review every few years and they say, yeah, it's the best model to follow. So when these executives order sort of throw away these well-established, scientific concepts, all it's going to do is going to result in increasing exposure to radiation during normal operation, and also the relaxation of safety design and mitigations that would lead to accidents with catastrophic consequences in a nuclear plant. So I just want to talk about this real quick. You can find this. NPR did like a really great investigation into, the different documents that have been changed under the current administration, given these executive orders. We have the trigger for accident investigation being raised, right? So what's considered an accident has now, been changed for the worse. We have groundwater rules that are loosened. We have security rules slashed, especially when we're talking about the protection of uranium. And we have environmental protections stripped. So what this means is that we're seeing that the deregulation of nuclear energy to accelerate its development in service of AI. And this increases the risk of the public's exposure to ionizing radiation without any substantiating benefit to justify it or any scientific proof of why we should use another set of scientific models. So that's one of those tracks. The second track is a generative AI, use of generative AI in nuclear licensing. Even, when we're looking at these like hastened timelines and lower thresholds, the discrepancy between AI's energy demands and timescale to construct the plants themselves still exists. Like that's not enough to try to build a plant within 2 years. So now AI executives have come out, specifically Microsoft using OpenAI models, to claim that the timelines for licensing nuclear plants are too lengthy, and quote, licensing is the single biggest bottleneck for getting new nuclear projects online. So Microsoft has been investing greatly in selling the use of LLMs for nuclear licensing. They've been giving presentation to the NRC and various nuclear conferences, again, talking about how licensing is a bottleneck. The solution to that is LLMs. And so at this point, you might be wondering, well, what is nuclear licensing and why should I care about the use of LLMs for it? So basically, nuclear licensing is one of the most important processes of designing and then constructing a nuclear plant. A license is essentially issued by a nuclear regulatory authority for the safe operation of a nuclear facility. And essentially, you have to demonstrate that, across the entire life cycle of your nuclear plant, your plant can be safely operated. So it starts from the site and design review, the construction, commission operation, ongoing oversight, and even the decommissioning of the plant. So it spans the entire life cycle, right? And so it's not just a bit of red tape to get the nuclear plant going. So typically authorization is required at each stage, and you have to essentially maintain a relationship with the regulator and oversight throughout. And what the regulator typically expects is that you understand and control the risks of your plant. So the licensee have to demonstrate genuine understanding of the hazards that arise from normal operations, accidents, what would happen if you were to have an accident, what are the chances of that? The licensee has to reason and communicate safety of the plant. So the fundamental aim here is to give explanation of why the plant is safe, including talking about the designs that you made and the trade-off in those designs and communicating this through what we call a safety case. And finally, the licensee has to meet safety principles, including those provided by the IAEA and the nuclear regulators themselves. So it's safe to say here that these sets of documents are not a box-ticking exercise. It's actually the safety process itself. It's the procurement, the design, the verification, the validation, the decommissioning even of the plant. And AI labs are now trying to frame licensing as a documentation burden rather than the safety process itself. And I think, as many of you know here, LLMs are incredibly flawed with incredibly high error rates or hallucinations across applications, especially if they require precision, accuracy, and safety criticality, even if an AI is specifically trained on nuclear documentation, which is what Microsoft is trying to say. And, nuclear licensing requires absolute precision. This is where the design is happening. This is where the safety is happening. And so a hallucination or a minor error can have catastrophic and cascading consequences in the construction and operation of a plant. Just kind of a quick side note. there's also security issues in kind of giving these AI companies that specific data. Specifically, if you think about how, to be able to build a nuclear plant, you actually have the same know-how as how to build a nuclear weapon. So these are typically state-sensitive secrets. And I think we should also be asking a larger question. Well, should AI labs be able to even possess those types of nuclear secrets? And what does that mean for nuclear proliferation? And doesn't that entrench the power asymmetries that they currently have even more? So overall, I think that there's a concern that the use of generative AI will introduce greater risks to nuclear critical infrastructure that are disproportionate, again, to any of the benefits that the use of AI may produce. Finally, let's talk about advanced nuclear technology. I think we hear about SMRs everywhere, so I kind of want to give an idea of why it is that we're seeing AI companies sort of accelerate the investment in and push governments as well to do so for these new technology. Starting out with small modular reactors, which I'll call SMRs from now on. They're, have the same type of reaction as what we call large water reactors, which is that they're based on nuclear fission. And the whole idea is that you want to use a more modular design to hopefully achieve a more streamlined construction compared to larger water reactors. And they only produce about 300 megawatts instead of the 1 gigawatt that I was talking about for larger plants. And so kind of on the top image here, this is what a large nuclear or traditional nuclear plant typically looks like. You have something like a containment structure, which has a nuclear fission reaction in it. And then you essentially have water that goes around that system to generate steam, which goes into a turbine. And then you generate the power that goes into a grid. Water's condensed, goes back around in a cycle. And so typically you have one containment structure that's quite massive, and the nuclear fission is essentially controlled in that. The idea of SMR is, well, what if we just build it in a more modular way and we have a bunch of small reactions happening and we can connect those together instead? That's the whole idea behind it. You also have the idea of nuclear fusion. And, fission reactions are different from fusion reactions. And essentially, if you're into this stuff, it's the idea of joining two smaller atoms into one, while fission is the act of splitting a larger atom into two. In case you were curious about it, it's not a technology that exists yet. So, it's not like there's a design we can explain. But the whole point is that investment in SMRs and fusion is justified through these unsubstantiated claims that these technology, one, allow for expedited construction, and two, that the risk associated with nuclear are decreased relative to traditional plants. But that's actually not the reality. There's actually no current advances that would allow us to immediately deploy SMRs, and a lot of them are currently under prototypes. And we, I think, only have a couple deployed in China at the moment. And the thing is, to actually get to a viable design, that takes years of investment in making sure it's safe, making sure it works. So this is not something that's going to happen overnight, and we don't actually know if they work or not. We're also not sure if they achieve the same economy of scale of larger plants. If you build one large plant and you get 1 gigawatt out of that, let's say you need to build 3 or 4 to compensate for the same amount of energy, are the construction costs the same? In the end, it might not be any more cheaper than a traditional plant. Something about SMRs, though, is with existing designs, we're also seeing that they produce more complex nuclear waste, which makes it harder to dispose, and they actually produce more of it per unit of energy than larger plants. So again, the question of economy of scales come back, like, is it actually cheaper and faster and safer? And finally, a lot of the designs for current SMRs eliminate very well-established safety features, and this is again justified through size, but disregard scale and what we call common failure modes. So if you build something that's faulty, right, because you think it's smaller, so it's okay. If an accident happens, it's a smaller catastrophe of some sort, but you have a whole bunch of them, and they all have the same common fault, they're all going to fail in the same way. So I think there's a larger question of, no, I'm not actually sure that it would be safer, especially if you take away traditional safety design so you can make it cheaper. In terms of nuclear fusion, there's been no significant scientific advancement in the past decade to prove their feasibility. And in fact, there's a joke in the nuclear community that nuclear fusion has been away, 10 years away since the 1970s. And yet we are seeing Helion, which is one of the companies that Sam Altman has invested in, saying that they're going to have a plant by 2028. Let's say we even have a breakthrough in nuclear fusion, which again is not on the horizon. Just the physical act of constructing a plant takes way longer than that. So we're seeing a lot of unsubstantiated claims being thrown around. And this isn't just like oh, well, they're going to say it and they're not going to do it in the end. This actually has consequences on policy initiatives themselves, because these claims essentially skew the policymakers' perceptions on the efforts that are actually needed for safe plant construction operation. So when you have these constrained timelines, it should have us question the integrity of these designs, right? Especially if it's something we've never seen before. And the executive orders essentially exempt reactors from the requirements that all other designs before them had to meet. So this is essentially allowing for the deployment of untested reactor technologies across the US. This also means regulatory changes that subvert well-established nuclear safety norms and are not really, again, based on scientific and proven methodologies. And in terms of the SMR developers themselves, including those part of the DOE's reactor pilot program, they have no experience in operating, nuclear reactors. And that means that they don't have a safety record or a safety culture, as with a lot of traditional operators. And there's a lot of research that shows this is actually a core characteristic of nuclear safety, whose weakness has been significantly linked to nuclear accidents. So 3 Mile Island, for example, that nuclear accident was traced back to human factors and sort of safety culture and safety records. And there's a concern of all these startups popping up with none of that experience now operating these new, reactors that we actually don't know the safety of. So are any of these fast tracking initiatives justifiable, right? Proponents of AI, they justify deregulation through all these fast tracking initiatives by claiming that an increase in radiation risk is worthy for the societal benefit of AI, which I think a lot of us think is questionable. What is that benefit against that risk of radiation? Besides that, a core part of nuclear safety is actually based, again, on the concept of residual risks that must be reduced as far as reasonably practicable. So again, ALARA. And if nuclear plant risks have been previously justified because their ease of availability and flexibility to meet critical variable grid demands, like millions of homes, while keeping low CO2 emissions. And that's a calculus that was made many decades ago, that this might be a viable technology for us to lower those CO2 emissions, and it also allows us to power homes. But now it's completely different. Now, I think there's a larger question that if we shift the risk calculus of nuclear infrastructure to then instead be in service of AI, that actually might mean that the public's exposure to ionizing radiation is essentially relegated to unmaterialized societal benefits of AI without any of the benefits that civil nuclear capacity was intended to provide to begin with. So I hope, I'm happy to answer any questions after this, but I want to mention that we go into a lot more detail in this report here called Fission for Algorithms. And it's with my colleague, Dr. Sofia Guerra, who is a known person in the nuclear safety field. So if you have, much more detailed question, you might find it in the report. And otherwise, if you want to reach out, this is my AI Now Institute email. And it was great to be here.
Thank you so much, Heidi, for breaking all of that down for us. I am particularly struck by your analysis around the power asymmetries that this intensifies, and very much appreciate your expertise. We will drop Heidi's email into the chat. If you had questions about Heidi's presentation, again, please put them into the Q&A feature, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. If that's not working for you, you can use the chat as a backup. So, how do we push back against this agenda? At the poll at the beginning of our session, roughly 70% of folks showing up today said that they didn't yet understand the policy and the organizing strategy or weren't sure. So, right now, I'm going to briefly review the policy options and demands or our recommendations that we can make. And then Shai and Hillary will break down fights on the ground and different tactics and strategies there. Next slide. So very briefly, these policy recommendations come from the North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit, which is geared towards stopping, slowing, and restricting rampant data center expansion in the US at the local, state, and federal level. We include North Star interventions, the strongest possible options, and scaffolded steps to get there for when that's not feasible. Next slide. This toolkit is like a menu of options, mapping out all the possible policy tools from bans and zoning to water, air, energy, taxation, etc. So you can pick and choose what is going to work in your jurisdiction. Next slide. And we developed this toolkit in consultation with over 100 community organizers, state advocates, technical experts, and policymaker networks across the country. We're dropping in a link to the full list in the chat as well. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. What are the strongest possible policy interventions to stop nuclear expansion for the benefit of AI? Next slide. First, I want to discuss why our policy recommendations here are largely targeted at the federal level, not local, state, or tribal. At the height of the Cold War and in the wake of the Manhattan Project, Congress passed a law establishing a commission to govern nuclear energy. And then later in 1974, Congress transferred authority to regulate nuclear power to the newly created Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC. Through these federal actions, Congress preempted states and localities from governing issues of nuclear safety in favor of a centralized federal safety framework. What this means is that federal law supersedes local and state law on this issue. And while this session discusses how the current federal administration is undermining the NRC's independent authority to regulate nuclear energy, it is still true that most regulations around nuclear are federally governed, meaning localities and states have very little authority over nuclear development. This doesn't mean that there are no demands that can be made at the local, state, and tribal level, particularly in stopping specific facilities, but the intervention points are different. Next slide. So our recommendations here are designed to reject AI being used as justification to roll back nuclear energy regulations. Because the staggering demand for energy to power AI data centers cannot be met with capacity from our existing power grid, AI firms are turning to nuclear as a source for additional power. But the reality is, as Heidi explained, that these nuclear development timelines, often 10 to 20 years, cannot safely match the rapid pace of AI development. But despite this, the government is fast-tracking nuclear development in ways that raise serious safety and oversight concerns. Next slide. So we have 4 recommendations. First, the federal government must reject the expansion of the nuclear industry for the benefit of AI firms. Expanding nuclear power without robust safeguards, at minimum, can lead to catastrophic risk. Civilian exposure to radiation, nuclear power plant failures, as well as the devastating effects of nuclear weapons have, for very good reason, led to the development of safety and probabilistic risk frameworks, radiation dose limits, and safety culture. But ironically now, the pretense of an AI arms race with China is being used to discard the very risk and safety thresholds that were established by the Cold War era nuclear arms race. The government justifies this elevated risk level by arguing that accelerated adoption of AI will supposedly give the US a technological edge over its global adversaries and lead to widespread societal benefits. But these claims, to put it nicely, are not verifiable. And given the untested and unproven nature of AI technology and the catastrophic risks of expanding nuclear power without robust safeguards, federal policymakers can reject efforts to rapidly scale the nuclear industry to meet the demands of AI firms. Next slide. Second, federal policymakers can ban the use of AI in the nuclear energy permitting process. The government is concerningly using AI technologies to expedite regulatory processes such as nuclear licensing and commissioning for civil and defense nuclear facilities. Nuclear licensing, as Heidi explained, is a well-established process that requires nuclear operators to demonstrate that the risks arising from their lifetime operations will be adequately controlled and to take responsibility for controlling and addressing these risks. Introducing generative AI to supposedly streamline nuclear licensing increases the likelihood that mistakes will arise in the process. Research has consistently demonstrated the lack of accuracy of generative AI and large language models, including a high rate of inaccurate results and high hallucination rates. And even minute errors here can compromise nuclear safety thresholds and lead to catastrophic consequences, including widespread radiation exposure. Next slide. Third, the federal government can reinstate the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's independence. As I mentioned earlier, the NRC was established in 1974 to act as an independent regulator, meaning it was intentionally shielded from political or industry influence. But through a series of executive orders in 2025, the White House has slowly pulled back the NRC's independence, first enabling the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, to oversee the regulatory process, and later requiring the NRC to establish shortened timelines on nuclear licensing. The executive orders also ask the NRC to consult about radiation exposure levels with the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy, two agencies that are, one, incentivized to expedite AI adoption, and two, lack relevant experience with radiation exposure limits. So federal policymakers can reinstate the NRC's independence to ensure that nuclear safety is not compromised by political aims. Next slide. Finally, the federal government must reinstate requirements that nuclear energy permitting meet global established safety standards for nuclear regulation. These risk analysis frameworks date back to the earliest moments of discovery at the height of the Cold War, and risk and safety thresholds have developed and changed over time, influenced by catastrophic disasters and the resulting shifts in public perception. And these events led to the establishment of radiation dose limits and targets based on the concept of the linear no threshold model, or LNT, which determined that risk increases linearly with dose and that no level of radiation exposure is risk-free. This model has wide-ranging international consensus and is based on long-term and detailed studies. Safety analysts also developed the ALARA risk principle, as low as reasonably achievable, to ensure that catastrophic risks are kept within tolerable societal limits, if we want to determine that that exists. But the White House executive orders in May 2025 recommend dismantling LNT and ALARA, rejecting this international consensus and increasing the public's risk of exposure to ionizing radiation. These should be reinstated. We often get the question of how to prevent the expansion of SMRs, or small modular reactors. Critically, if we kept stringent nuclear regulations, SMRs wouldn't be able to be built. Next slide. And finally, I just want to briefly talk about local and state and tribal interventions. While they do not target directly nuclear energy, data center moratoriums at the local, state, and tribal level, as well as any regulation to limit the amount of data center growth, can effectively stall the development of data centers and thus reduce the amount of energy needed to accelerate AI adoption. Moratoriums are temporary pauses on the permitting, approval, or construction of data centers in a specific jurisdiction. They are just one way to restrict data centers. For more, you can see our past training sessions on bans, moratoriums, and zoning. The recording link is in the chat. This is an indirect connection, but it is important given that mass AI adoption is being used to justify the deregulation of the nuclear industry. And similarly, communities can also prohibit off-grid and behind-the-meter power generation, which is also known as bring your own power solutions. These proposals might sound like a good idea, but often mean expanded gas generation or nuclear power and allow data centers to sidestep investments in the shared energy infrastructure they benefit from. And again, we have a whole session about energy and ratepayer protections with more information there. I'm going to now ask Sophie to stop screen sharing and bring up our incredible panel so we can learn how people organizing on the ground are pushing back against this nuclear build-out. So give a big warm welcome to Shai Morgan. Shai is an enrolled member of the Kiowa Band of Cherokees and comes from the Oglala Lakota Nation. Shai is the coalition coordinator for Stop Data Colonialism, a national Indigenous coalition of tribal members organizing to stop the mass expansion of hyperscale data centers and generative AI on tribal lands and to educate tribal and municipal leaders about their impacts. And Hillary Flint is the program director at the Center for Oil and Gas Organizing and a consultant for the Beaver County Marcellus Awareness Community. Her work examines the public health consequences of corporate greed and regulatory failure, grounded in her lived experience as a cancer survivor, chronic illness warrior, and community member directly affected by the East Palestine train derailment and chemical disaster. Thank you so much to both of you for being here. Shai, I would love to start with you. In terms of the risks of nuclear energy, many people think of catastrophic disasters such as Fukushima and Chernobyl. Your work focuses on a wide range of impacts, particularly to Indigenous communities. How is expanded nuclear for data centers impacting Native people and lands?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a great question. When we look at the past, when we look at what has happened with nuclear in the last few decades, nearly all of the impacts from nuclear disasters have been on native lands, near native lands, and have impacted native people. Two of the largest disasters in this country have been on native lands. Native people have bore the brunt of those disasters. Um, and Cherokee Nation had to spend millions of dollars to clean up Kerr-McGee's project called Sequoia Fuels. Uranium and thorium contamination contaminated the soils and subsoils, and of course that has a half-life of, millions of years. And then Church Rock spill, New Mexico. Um, in 1979, it was one of the dams broke for the retention pond there for the byproduct of the mining in Church Rock, and it was as bad as the incident at 3 Mile Island. Um, yes, so when we talk about how much money that big tech has put into the expansion of or revitalization of nuclear. It's very concerning because we've already had these disasters, and that is why we have these regulations that we have now, because people have paid the price for this expansion, and people will continue to pay the price.
Thank you. And as you pointed out, it's really important to also pay attention to who is paying the price, and who is not. Uh, Hillary, you support communities directly targeted by the nuclear build-out as well, specifically in Pennsylvania and New York. Can you talk us through what the impacts are for some of these communities and the wide range of reasons that people are opposing expanded nuclear for data centers specifically?
It would take a long time to explain all of the reasons that people are opposed to data centers in general and data centers connected to either nuclear facilities that already exist, ones that have been shut down, ones that are proposed. But I think it really comes down to three things that I'm seeing on the ground. Number one, health risks. Communities in the Finger Lakes right now are fighting a proposed facility in Schuyler County, and they are talking about all of the different studies that have been done on community members across the country. And something that is really shocking to them is that there is no type of national cancer study done near US reactors. We just have piecemeal information from across different communities. So one of the questions they're asking is, how can we expand this when we don't have the data to prove that our health is not going to be impacted? And we'll put a couple studies in the chat of things that they are referencing. For example, in New York already, we know that thyroid cancer rates have just raised extensively, a 708% increase since the nuclear facility went online in Indian Point. So when we're talking about building new facilities, people are saying, we already know it's impacting our health here. Communities in Pennsylvania are talking about the safety risks. Three Mile Island to this day is still the worst accident in US history for commercial nuclear facilities. And that exact facility is now going to be a Microsoft data center to power AI. And not only that, they are receiving $1 billion, billion with a B, from the US government to do it. And so people are saying, hey, we've already seen an accident happen at this facility. It seems wild that we are just going to restart this for something that no one here has asked for. And on that note, the thing that I see across every community is everyone fighting data centers, everyone fighting nuclear, petrochemical pipelines. It's all an issue of consent. So none of these people asked for this. We're seeing the government fast track things. For example, Three Mile Island, they're being fast tracked by FERC, and there have not been a lot of opportunities for that community to weigh in on the process. Residents have said they feel like this plant's restart is a done deal from the very start, and they are not the decision makers. And that makes no sense because it's their lives and their safety at risk. So it just all comes back to the question of, who are we building this for? Because it's not the people that live in these communities.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Kind of on that theme, Shai, how does the expansion and the deregulation of nuclear energy fit into broader fights against data colonialism? Can you break down that term for us as well in your answer?
So there's really two terms that I use when talking about data centers and the connection to nuclear. That's techno-colonialism and data colonialism. Um, Really, this is like a manifestation of the continuation of extractive industries exploiting Indigenous communities. We've seen it across every sector of extractive energy. We've seen it in mining, we've seen it in coal, we've seen it in oil and gas with the pipelines, uranium mining, solar, wind farms, every extractive energy that there is, it has exploited Indigenous communities. With the deregulation of nuclear and its connection to data colonialism, it just really is a continuation of the level of extraction that Indigenous communities have to face all of the time. We have little to no recourse on how we can have input on these conversations. And often when we are asked for input, and we say, no, we don't want this in our communities, they do it anyways. And we're seeing that manifestation across the country and non-native communities as well. Yeah.
And just to connect this to other fights as well, Hillary, we often find ourselves having separate conversations around fossil fuels and nuclear. What are the connections between these industries? Like Shai, you talked about extractive industry, right? What are the connections between them in terms of motivation and how they work together and potentially how we push back?
In the past, we've viewed all of these issues as separate. And what I think data centers in general have taught us is that all of these different industries are working together. And communities aren't just fighting one type of industry typically, they're fighting multiple. So much so that my organization is actually going from Center for Oil and Gas Organizing to Center for Organizing because it's no longer one industry. Fossil fuel companies, nuclear operators, big tech, they're all working together. And it's to increase their profit, and it's the people that suffer. These data centers require tons of energy. So to meet that demand, they have to partner, big tech has to partner with gas-fired power plants. They have to build pipelines. And it's all just a lifeline to save these dying industries, which are frankly dying because they're unsafe, not good for the environment, and not good for people. This isn't being done to lower our utility bills. It's not being done to improve affordability. It's not being done because communities have asked for these data centers. It's being done because there's enormous money to be made at the intersection of AI, energy, and all of the infrastructure that has to be built out. So, at the same time, we're seeing them accelerate approvals and weaken oversight and limit meaningful public participation. Industry and government officials are using mechanisms like the Defense Production Act across these industries. It's not just for fossil fuels anymore. It's not just for nuclear. They are using that for many different things. And so when we see the government and corporations working together, it again, the question's simple. It's our air that's going to be affected. It's our drinking water. It's our lives. And so why don't the people living here have a meaningful say in what is being built? All of these people are working together to put something on us when I thought this was the country, of the people, for the people, by the people. So why don't the people have a say what's going in their backyards? Why is it corporations across all industries? Um, that is what's happening here. They're working together, but the good news is there's more of us than there is of them.
And the pep talk that I'm going to say I didn't know I needed, but I really needed. So thank you both of you. I want to spend the remaining time we have in our discussion talking about organizing strategy and how you and the communities who you work with and are accountable to are pushing back against this build out. Let's start with Hillary this time and then go to Shai. So what organizing or other strategies are you trying at the tribal, local, and state levels?
Well, the good news is the people are organizing, and they are organizing without nonprofits. They're organizing without formal leadership. People are ready to move on this issue across the political spectrum. So just yesterday, we stood along hundreds of Pennsylvanians at the state capitol in Harrisburg, where folks are calling for a statewide moratorium on data centers. And I was so happy to see there was a media article that said this might have been the most bipartisan action ever in Pennsylvania. Next week, New Yorkers are having a week of action to oppose Governor Hochul's proposed nuclear build out. And we will be encouraging people across the state to also sign on to support the data center moratorium that New York is almost passing. They're just waiting for Governor Hochul's signature. So there's a lot of statewide action happening. We've had to pivot. Our organization typically did a lot of national organizing, sometimes state level, but people are doing this at the municipal level. So we are figuring out what do the communities want, what do their grassroots leaders want, and then following their lead. So a lot of times it's educating them about things like moratoriums and ordinances and all of these things that, our organization hadn't taken on, but we had to because that is how people are winning right now in the states we operate in. And so, we're fortunate to work with great partners. There's so many good people working on this issue, in addition to great community members. So, Food and Water Watch, Frack Tracker Alliance, Environmental Health Project. At the state level, we have Frack Action, Seneca Lake Guardian, Better Path Coalition, Three Rivers Waterkeeper. Um, every week, every day, there's organizing going on at the local, regional, and national level. There are coalitions built fighting back against this. There are new community groups. We have a Facebook group for data center resistance in Pennsylvania that is at 35,000 people, and we just started it like a month ago. That is how quickly this movement is moving, and that gives me tons of hope. And so we're even seeing elected officials start to move slowly across the line on their opinions on AI. They're asking hard questions, and it's because we are pushing them. And I truly, at this point, believe it's a fight we can win, but only if we continue to do it together and we build this power together, which we are doing. Again, across political lines, we have farmers, we have environmental justice leaders, all different types of people showing up to actions together at every level possible. And that is a thing that we have not seen in this movement in a very long time. So I have tons of hope that whether, we're doing this locally at different state levels, at the federal level, I have tons of hope that because the people are organizing, the people will win.
Shy, same question to you.
Oh man, that was really good, Hillary. So we have been working with a coalition of Native folks from different states, different tribes, and we started organizing uh, around data center development because of the direct connection to small modular reactors and how they're wanting to test this build out on native lands. Currently, we are trying to stay informed and hopefully halt a development here outside of Oklahoma, in Parsons, Kansas. It is very near a critical aquifer. It's called Deep Fission. They're wanting to bury a small modular reactor a mile down in the ground and uh, pressurize that small modular reactor to provide power. And this is basically a testing site for future small modular reactor developments. Additionally, on top of that, we're talking to our state legislators, we're talking to our municipal leaders, pushing for moratoriums on data centers because we know that there's a connection to nuclear development and data centers because these tech companies have invested billions of dollars into this technology that is not safe, as we know now. And it's working. Our tribal leaders have listened to us, and we have tribes across the country that are starting to impose moratoriums on data centers because the fact of the matter is these developments are scary. They're very dangerous for our people. They're dangerous for our kids. When we think about how we want to leave the world after we leave, we don't want to just take everything that we have right now and leave nothing for our kids and our grandkids and our grandkids, kids, and so on. So the strategies that we have been really embracing is education and talking about the nitty-gritty truth. Like these data centers are for surveillance. They're connected to the extraction of Indigenous peoples yet again. Yeah, yeah.
I think the yet again is really important to remember. There's a lot of industry propaganda making these things sound shiny and new, and it might be a new coding, but it's the same old playbook. Sophie's going to launch a poll for our participants to see what remaining questions you still have so we can follow up. A huge thank you, Hillary and Shai. Could not be more grateful. Just going to briefly touch on two questions that came up in the chat. First, there was a question about bring your own power and what are the pitfalls with that. In addition to those that we unpacked around nuclear energy, we get into that a lot more in the session on energy and policy for data centers. So we're going to drop that link into the chat as well. And then there was a question also of how do we oppose data centers, or how can we move our communities to oppose data centers if our young people or whoever uses ChatGPT? And so just want to highlight that Again, those driving the build out are not a young person using ChatGPT here and there, right? But all of the actors, these industries that we've been discussing, big tech, private equity, the administration pushing that onto our society. And our last session, mapping the data center industry, got into that a little bit more. Okay, Sophie, can you share the slides one more time? We're just going to go over a few resources to close us out. Thank you again, Shai and Hillary. We have resources in the chat and on the slides here for you to learn more. So again, please do the poll that has just popped up on the screen to let us know what your remaining questions are. This officially concludes our data center policy in practice series. On the first slide you saw, and in the chat, we have all of these resources, recordings of the trainings, etc., and a way to reach out to get policy support. And we're including here resources to learn more about Honor the Earth, Stop Data Colonialism, the Center for Oil and Gas Organizing, and we will share out a link to all of the many resources that Hillary, Shai, and others put into the chat. Thank you so much to everyone here. If you are looking for support with your site fight, if you are actively involved in a particular data center site fight, the Data Center Working Group runs monthly site fight solidarity hours. And if you'd like to get more involved in the Data Center Working Group, you can fill out our interest form to join work at the local, state, or federal level. Thank you so much again. We are going to leave the Zoom open for just a minute to allow more people to finish filling out the poll. But panelists, we are done for the day. I'll take another look in case there's any remaining questions. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.